This episode of the AD History Podcast is brought to you by listeners like you, contributing through the crowdfunding platform Patreon. Learn more about how you can support the show by visiting patreon.com/ADHistoryPodcast and the exclusive benefits that await your generous support. Thank you. Have you ever wondered the origins of the infamous Attila the Hun? Or how much the no-goodnik son of Theodosius I, Emperor Honorius, unwittingly contributed to Western Rome's impending demise? Well, do we have some stories for you?
This is the AD History Podcast, weaving a tapestry of world history from 1AD to HD. Powered by TGNR. Get your good news that's real news at TGNR by visiting tgnreview.com. Now here are your hosts, Paul K. DiCostanzo and Patrick Foote.
And brought to you via London and New York City, you are listening to the AD History Podcast. I am Paul K. DiCostanzo, and I am joined by my co-host, Patrick Foote. And Patrick, at time of recording, this is the first time you and I have recorded in 7 weeks. We're coming off of a 7-week hiatus.
I know. I hope I still know how to do this, how we still know how to do this. It's been a strange 7 weeks between just time off and various other things. We've had a huge break, but we're back now. Hopefully you guys haven't been as well, but we've had so much in the bank that, Paul, you've been tediously producing to get out while we haven't been recording. But no, it's exciting times ahead.
They definitely are.
Yeah.
And today, we are going to have a couple of really great subjects. On my part, we're finally getting into really one of the giants of history. A very interesting one that everybody listening right now has most certainly heard of. And that, of course, is the infamous Attila the Hun.
I would say this is probably the first big figure from history who isn't of Roman descent. Like, obviously, we talked about a lot of Chinese figures, but like, someone known around the world, like Wang Meng isn't a world-renowned historic figure. Like, this is one of the first times we've talked about a historical figure who isn't Roman. I mean, I guess Boudica many, many, many moons ago, but it's exciting to see that these other cultures are finally starting to creep their way into our narrative.
Of course, Jesus wasn't Roman
of course,
either.
Yeah, Jesus too, of course, my bad. Forgot about the big man.
Yeah. Really a huge non-Roman towering figure.
But conversely, I'm talking about a Roman character who is very non-towering by any means. It's quite a contrast between who you're talking about and who I'm going to be talking about in today's episode.
Well, it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to getting back into the swing of things, doing what needs to be done. It's good to be sitting here with you again and sitting with you, listening or watching wherever you may be watching or listening. And with all of that in mind and all of it out of the way, it is time to lay down our necessary, obligatory, now legendary AD History Podcast Ground Rules. 1. Evaluate events in the context they occurred. 2. Over the span of recorded history, the way it was recorded, its methodology, and the facts that are important have changed immensely. How we view history today is not necessarily how we viewed it 50 years ago. 3. Nothing in history was inevitable. And 4, history and the past is like a different country. Right here, we have a new and interesting figure that most of you are unfamiliar with. I certainly was not that familiar with this figure, but you get to introduce us to one Honorius.
Honorius. We will probably be saying it in multiple different ways during this episode. Obviously, we don't have any verbal evidence of how this name was pronounced, as we tend to not do it this far back in history. But yeah, Honorius, a very interesting figure in Roman history, and one I have actually mentioned in passing before.
Well, one thing is for sure, we will be saying it in many different ways, but so long as we get it done, the only thing I can say to that is,
I'd buy that for $1.
You're forever.
Are you RoboCop fans in the audience?
You're always finding a new uses for your new piece of tech, Paul. Your fancy stream deck thing. I'm not sure. I'm a confused old man in the world of streaming, but You're always finding a new sounds to pump out of that weird machine of yours.
Damn straight. Damn straight. So, Mr. Foot.
Say those famous
Honorius.
words.
Mr. Foot. Sir Patrick, you have the floor.
And as you recently mentioned to me, and now I'm very aware that I always say it, so yeah. I never noticed I said it so much until you mentioned it, and now I'm very aware of the fact. But yes, as I mentioned, we actually talked about Honorius a while back. So if you cast your memory back, I mentioned an emperor by the name of Honorius, and he was the one who actually declared that Britain would no longer be under Roman rule. And in today's episode, in my segment, we're going to be looking more deeply into the life of this emperor. And that's because his reign actually came to an end during this decade. So Honorius, however we're going to say it, is one of the stranger emperors of Western Rome. And I find myself saying that quite a lot these days between Maximinus, Thrax, Elagabalus. We're getting to some very strange emperors.
Yeah.
And he certainly did his part in this empire's fall from grace. But many have actually dubbed him Rome's worst emperor. And I'm just...
That's saying a lot.
It is saying a lot. And I'm just curious if that's really the case. So I want to talk to you, Paul, and the listeners and our viewers about this guy's life and what he did, and if he really deserves that title. So Honorius was born in 384 AD in Constantinople. So that's something quite interesting off the bat, that we're at a point now we're at a point now that well-to-do people are being born in Constantinople. For the previous decades, it's been the city people go to, but we're at a point now where it's so well established that nobility are being born there. And I think that's...
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they're a whole capital.
Mm-hmm. It is well and truly cemented.
A new capital of a new empire.
A new empire, of course. So
it's being carved out of the Bosphorus.
As it's happening. And he was the youngest son of Emperor Theodosius I. I believe he was the last unified emperor of Rome. Memory serves.
Theodosius?
Yeah.
Theodosius first? Yes.
Yes. I knew something. It's been 7 weeks, Paul, as we established. So, and he seems to have been quite well liked by his father. And Honorius was dubbed the Nobilissimus Puella, which means the most noble child. And he was actually made consul at the tender age of 2 years old.
Well, that's never going to get abused.
No. So he was actually proclaimed emperor in 393 AD at just 9 years old. But his father didn't actually die till 2 years later in 395 AD, and that was when the empire.
Good on him.
Yeah, that was when the empire was split. And as I mentioned, Honorius was the younger son of Theodosius I, so he got Western Rome. But his older brother Arcadius, he got the East. So the empire's fully split by now. As we mentioned, Theodosius was the last one, and the reason it split for the final time was just because he decided his two sons should get half the empire each.
Was Arcadius any better than his brother?
So it's interesting.
I mean, I guess that depends on how you qualify better.
Yeah,
which I should
exactly.
say more qualified, more naturally inclined towards the role, something that makes him a preferential option.
So if memory serves, I did a tiny bit of research on Arcadius. It seems... Part of me would say no, in the fact he didn't actually rule for that long. Granted, he ruled in the East, and maybe this title of Rome's worst emperor is more looking at the West, but Arcadius didn't rule anywhere near as long as Honorius in the East. I think he died pretty young. I can't remember how exactly he died, but there's already another potential candidate for the worst emperor of Rome, because he did it far less longer than his brother. But it's a strange one. Maybe another time we can go to Arcadius, and what we missed, we'll check out his life.
That would make sense.
Yeah. I want to talk about his early reign now. And what's interesting is his early reign was actually very revolving around another person in particular. Like I said, he became emperor when he was 9, and then fully became emperor of the West when he was about 10 or 11 or so, 2 years later. So as we know, childhood power, this is a story we've heard so many times. Did someone say the R word? Am I hearing the word regent in the back there? And his regent was a man named Flavius Stilicho. So Stilicho was a Roman military commander, and he was actually being considered Western Rome's last great general. So we've got something going on here, Paul. We've got, even though he's not actually emperor, we've got a military man ruling the roost here. Is that sounding a little bit familiar to yourself?
Well, there does seem to be a few familiar notes in this melody.
Mm.
And, if you are a long time or an intermediate length time listener or viewer of AD history, especially if you are quite familiar with an ongoing theme from our third season, is this a potential return, at least to a smidgen, of what we might know, or you watching or listening, you might know as well, as a barrack emperor, at least as a proxy.
It feels like it, doesn't it? Like this is all the markings of a military man taking power. I mean, there are differences. Undoubtedly, there are differences. Like he wasn't actually emperor. Honorius was still emperor, and he was just a regent. And also, he wasn't elected emperor by his troops. That's how the barrack emperors came to be. Their army, their military, their army. Your emperor now.
I think using the term elected isn't
Elected.
quite the term.
Declared.
I would say proclaimed. Through I would say compensation.
Yeah.
Through motivation through compensation.
Yes, but
starts with a B and ends with ribe.
Yes, that too. But that didn't happen in this case. He was chosen. I don't know who exactly he was chosen by, but it wasn't the case where his men proclaimed, B-worded him into being emperor. So there are definitely similarities there. It's definitely a military man ruling the roost, but it's actually quite, on the surface level, it seems somewhat similar, but if you look deeper down, there is a bit of a different story going on here.
Do go on.
So one of the first things Honorius and Stilicho did, they actually moved their capital twice. So he initially moved, Honorius initially moved his court to Milan, the Italian city of Milan. Yet, either in 401 or 402 AD, the court was moved to the Italian city of Ravenna. And it might sound strange to think why. Why would you move the capital so often? Like, even Rome isn't the capital anymore.
And to Ravenna, of all cities.
So Ravenna, if memory serves, Ravenna is a very mountainous town or city. It's up in the north. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's up in the north, like beyond the peninsula of Italy, if memory serves. And this is a tactical thing. By now, the Italian peninsula was being invaded left, right, and center by Huns, by Germanic tribes. Rome,
they've been getting beat over the head, most definitely.
So it just made sense to be somewhere where the mountains and hills are in your favor, because this wasn't a time where you could be a sitting target. You needed to be as defensed as possible if you were in Western Rome right now. If you were in a position of power in Western Rome, you had a very big target on your head. And I say big because it was a very easy target to hit, because Western Rome wasn't the power it once was. But Stilicho, as we have seen with regents in the past, had plans beyond just being Honorius's regent, it seems. He wanted to give his power legitimacy, and he actually married off both of his daughters to Honorius. So his daughter Maria, he married her off in 398 AD, and then she died in 407 AD. So then his second daughter, Fermantia, he married her off in 408 AD, straight off the bat. So he really wanted to have his bloodline, his daughter, as his wife. So it made more sense. It gave his power more legitimacy. If you're watching House of the Dragon right now, if you watch Game of Thrones, this is that sort of stuff playing out once again. That's something we should talk about at some point in the future, Paul. So initially, Stilicho, he seemed to have actually been pretty popular amongst the people of Rome. Despite being a regent, people were like, no, we like this guy. We're happy to have him ruling in proxy for our child emperor. But he seems to have grown power mad. And he had different plans. So he had different plans for his son, however. He wanted him to do something different. As I mentioned, Arcadius, Honorius's brother, he actually died in 408 AD. So, as I mentioned, his reign wasn't too long. And with no one as emperor in Eastern Rome, Stilicho thought, well, I have a son. He could go sit on that throne for me. But the only problem being is that by this point, Stilichow's influence had actually really declined. For one reason or another, he wasn't as popular as he was in his heyday. Whatever the case, this actually resulted in his assassination in 408 AD. So Stilichow was off. And Honorius had killed his own top advisor. And as quite a young person still, Honorius wasn't too much of a decision maker himself. And Western Rome, as we know, was already in a bit of a perilous situation right now. The last thing it needed was a clueless ruler who had literally killed off his best man, his key decision maker. So Rome was absolutely primed to be taken down a peg or two. And that's exactly what happened, Paul, with the famous sacking of Rome. And this sacking happened in 410 AD. And this is the first time Western Rome had ever been sacked. Potentially. There's a mythical sacking by the Gauls in 387 BC I read about, but I said this is sort of mythical. We're not too sure on the facts of this one. But whatever the case, this is a huge deal that Rome was sacked. It just once again shows how much the city of Rome had fallen. Because Rome was never sacked. Rome was the place to be. Rome was the place Hannibal Barca got to the doors of and turned round. To see it sacked now is very upsetting.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, at this point, Rome ain't what it used to
No,
be.
totally not. Rome is far from what it's used to be. You know what, Paul? Slight tangent here. But something
Yeah, by all means.
Something I'm interested in seeing through AD history is
Yes.
Rome's rise again. Because as we know, in our modern life, Rome is the capital of Italy. I'm curious to know when that happened once again. Because even when it split from west to east, Rome wasn't even a big deal in Rome wasn't even a big deal in the Western Roman Empire. As we mentioned, Ravenna is the capital right now. I'm curious to see when Rome solidifies itself as Italy's capital once again. I don't personally know myself when it is.
It seems to me like Rome in particular has a much greater stature in general, but it has kind of what I would call kind of like the Jerusalem effect, where its importance as a city waxes and wanes over an extremely long period of time, where there are times when, that's where it's hopping, that's where it matters, and then other times it kind of lets its gut out and almost kind of slides into, relatively speaking, comparatively more dubious state, and it just declines in importance. But for whatever reason, it's up and down over a long period of time. And right now, it's definitely on a decline. And it's been on the decline for quite some time.
Yeah, totally. So, it's on the decline at the moment. It seems so strange to even to our modern ears. We know Rome now as the capital to hear it like that. But you got to remember, this isn't the Rome it was then, and it isn't the Rome it is now. This is just another city in the empire. Despite the fact it's the city that's the empire's namesake, it's just another city. And while, as mentioned, we said Rome was no longer the capital of the West, it was still a huge deal, and it was the symbolism Rome had. And it being sacked shows us just how much Western Rome and the city itself was in decline. And who was it doing the sacking? And it was, of course, the Visigoths, led by King Alaric. And when they flooded into the city, they stole and killed pretty much anyone and anything they could. And they burnt buildings down, and the city was devastated. But that kind of contradicts something else we've talked about. I said the city was devastated, but we know now there are still many buildings in Rome from its ancient period that still stand.
And I'm curious, how many, as far as we know, right? I'm not talking about the Pantheon, but as far as we know, it's certainly in terms of your research, Lord Foote, do you know how many buildings are believed to have actually survived?
So, not off the top of my head, I don't know, I'm afraid. But the Pantheon's a great one you mentioned, Paul. So obviously we've got things like the Colosseum, which is still standing to a degree. The Roman Forum is still standing once again to a degree. but stuff still standing in really good condition, not too sure about. But as you mentioned, the Pantheon is a great example of why some buildings did stand the test of time.
I swear that thing seems like it could survive nuclear holocaust.
It really could, and it all comes down to religion, Paul. So the Pantheon, as we mentioned, back in when it was first built, it was a temple to the all gods, to all the gods of Rome's pagan religion, and then it became a Christian temple. And the Visigoths, while vastly different to the Romans, they had the same religion. This is where we're at. You know, the Germanic tribes and the Romans, they're all Christian, and the Visigoths respected the Christianity of Rome. They'd happily destroy anything else, but when it came to religious sites like the Pantheon, because it was a Christian church by now, it still is to this day, they were like, no, we won't destroy that. So it was religion saved the day here for these buildings anyway, not for the people. They were probably still happy to kill Christians, I imagine. They were probably weren't checking that.
Well, you know, the violence sings its own song. But do you think it's just architectural, or do you think there might be some divine providence?
Maybe there is something divine going on there. Maybe these holy lights were bursting down onto these buildings saying, no, we will not destroy them. But anyway, the sacking lasted 3 whole days, and Rome was stripped of pretty much all its valuables. And St. Jerome, he wrote on the matter. He said, the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. And that kind of sums things up perfectly there from good old St. Jerome speaking
Yeah, I
on
was
the
about to
matter.
say, Jerry's on top of this one.
Yeah, cheers, Jess. But what was Honorius, the Roman emperor, doing at this time? And of course, he was nowhere near Rome. He was in his capital of Ravenna.
Yes.
And his reaction to this sacking is quite potentially the most infamous thing about this emperor. And his alleged reaction, I need to say anyway.
Yeah,
Because-
what was Hono doing in all this?
Well, it's kind of steeped in myth, his reaction to this. We don't know how true, if at all, it is. And supposedly, Honorius, he loved birds. He genuinely loved birds. He loved pigeons and chickens. And his favorite chicken was named Rome/Roma, obviously Latin.
Of course.
And apparently he was told by his informants that Rome had fallen, and he was absolutely heartbroken. Not because he thought the city was fallen, he thought his favorite chicken had died. He was
Oh,
like,
boy.
"No, Rome, my favorite chicken is gone." But
I don't know. I don't know if that's better or worse or comparable to what Nero was doing when Rome was burning.
having a good sing song. No, it's kind of it's on a similar level for a different reason. It's very similar to that reaction. That's undoubtedly. We'll talk about like the public reaction to it, because a big part of this, very similar to Nero, is if we don't know if it's true or not, but it plays a relevant role anyway, regardless of how true it was. But no, anyway, so he thought his favorite chicken had died, and upon finding out that Rome the chicken was doing just fine, he stopped worrying. He was, oh, it's just the city being sacked. That's fine. It's fine. The eternal city being sacked worried him very little, as long as his chickens were safe. And it's an incredibly strange story. And it's actually,
talk about priorities.
yeah, and it's one most modern historians regard as fiction.
They do believe this is apocryphal.
Yeah, but so you got to ask ourselves, if it's regarded as fiction, why are we talking about it? And what's interesting is,
That's a damn good question, Mr. Foot.
so this story is believed to be somewhat contemporaneous, as in this isn't something this story that happened way down the line. This was something people were saying around the time it was going on. And even if it was fictitious, it kind of shows us what the people of Rome thought of him, that they were making up these silly stories, that he was busy tending to chickens. And chickens and pigeons, bless them, they have a bit of an image of being sort of dumb birds. So it kind of, that solidifies. He wasn't like tending to his horses, these wise, noble creatures. He was looking after his chickens, the animal deeply associated with cowardness. Like it paints, it's almost like a political cartoon in some way. It's like a spitting image type thing. He was more concerned looking after his dumb birds than his empire.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing here is
Mm.
that whether it's true or whether it's not,
Mm.
the valuable takeaway is the fact that it seems to be something that's being perpetuated
Mm.
by, your average Roman on the street. It
Exactly.
lets you into their thinking and
Yeah.
their perception of him. And, at the very least, it's something that is being perpetuated by some interested party.
Mm. No, it's exactly. It just sort of shapes. It kind of gives us, as you mentioned, Paul, a look into the image this guy had at the time. But this wasn't the only strange thing he had. While he had a love of birds, he had some other strange quirks knocking around too. He was known for banning two things in Rome. He is thought to have banned gladiatorial combat for the final time, and trousers, pants, as you might call them, Paul.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, gladiatorial combat and pants.
Yeah. So let's talk about gladiatorial combat for a moment here first, Paul. And
Absolutely.
it was already on the decline anyway, and I believe it actually already been banned once before by Constantine. But Honorius put just a flat out stop to it. As far as I'm aware, this is the last time it got banned, and it stayed banned.
But why? But why did he decide to ban it, of all things?
So there was a story behind this, if memory serves. I didn't take
boy, we
notes
got
of it.
another story.
Annoyingly. No. I believe a religious figure. I believe an important religious figure got caught up in a gladiatorial battle, like a priest or a bishop of some kind.
Some kind of clergy ended up in some kind of gladiatorial combat.
Or like died on the sidelines. There was something along that. Of course, Honorius was a deeply Christian person, as all Western Roman emperors were by now. And seeing that happen, he was like, no, this has got to stop. I should have taken note of it. We can maybe talk about it in our next episode or whatever. But there was definitely a story behind it. He saw someone of religious importance being heavily affected by gladiatorial combat and went, no, I'm axing this.
Mm.
But as we mentioned, he had this strange ban of trousers, pants.
Yes.
Which does sound strange, but as you said, Paul, you're kind of on
Very
board with this.
strange.
And Honorius had his reasons. So trousers were seen as very much military clothing by this point, and the Roman army.
I can understand that.
Yeah, and the Roman army had started to wear them, and they were worn by barbarians, by Germanic tribes too.
Mhm.
Honorius did not want the populace to dress in the same way as barbarians or the military. He wanted them to be different. He didn't want them to look like the enemy or the people fighting the enemy, so he flat out banned them. So there is method to the madness with this one.
Certainly. And it's an interesting thought how there are so many innovations, especially innovation when you're talking about technology, but you can expand beyond that and not be without plenty of examples. But it's fascinating to me, perhaps it is fascinating to you, how so many trends or technologies that become integral and just everyday parts of life where their point of origination is the military. Or if you want to get even a more modern take on this, think about all the incredibly awesome things that were originally, for the most part, first put into serious play through an organization like NASA that we now get to enjoy every day. And starting with the most important thing by far, which of course is Tang.
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 What's Tang? Is Tang an American thing I'm not aware of? Tang.
Oh, Tang. You're not familiar with Tang. All right.
My idea is it's some sort of fizzy, like, soda drink.
Okay, so Tang is a powder. It's an orange powder.
I'm seeing it now, yeah.
You put it in water, you shake it up, and it gives you like a bunch of nutrients, and it tastes reasonably decent. And indeed, if I understand correctly, at the very least, it first reached prominence with NASA and the various early phases of putting manned missions from low Earth orbit all the way to the surface of the moon itself.
Wow. Tang.
Indeed.
Is
Tang.
Is that what Kool-Aid's kind of similar to it as well? Like a powder you
There
mix?
are similarities. I mean, granted, I have not had Tang to drink since I was a kid, without a doubt. But you kind of get the idea.
Yeah,
you kind of get the idea.
And that started with NASA. So it's kind of like astronaut food, but I believe astronauts never actually ate astronaut food. That was just something else as well. Something strange. But
A lot of freeze-dried stuff.
You're totally correct how saying like so much stuff comes from military and like so much scientific advances, but fashion advances as well. So one I find interesting, Paul, is T-shirts are actually, if memory serves, I remember reading once, T-shirts came from the Navy, I believe. And then from that, they kind of just went into, we all wear T-shirts. Weirdly enough, neither of us are wearing one right now.
Oddly enough,
Normally
all the episodes that we've done, especially the ones where we're in front of a camera, this happens to be the one where we have full-length sleeves, both of us.
So, but no, I believe T-shirts were a military creation. And then from there, they spread to the populace. But no, it really does.
High tech.
Yeah, high tech innovations there. But no, so much comes through the military. I swear I remember reading once a quote saying most technological advances, I don't know how about, maybe I made this up. It's a quote I remember hearing once. Most technological advances either come from the military or pornography. Which is
They're both very, very strong driving forces in our world. Have been for a long time. And certainly in the 20th and especially the 21st centuries.
I don't know if you have an appropriate sound effect for that bit, but
I think we can forego that one and let wherever you may be listening or watching fill in the gaps in terms of what you think is the appropriate sound between your ears.
Could go on there, but let's go on to more serious subjects right now. Let's talk about Honorius's death. So Honorius died in 423 AD, which just gets us into the field of this episode's decade, thankfully. Despite how he was seen by many, somehow he wasn't actually assassinated. He actually died. He was believed to have died of edema, which is fluid buildup in the lungs. And his death day is recorded as the 15th of August, 423 AD. And when he died, he was 38 years old and had no issue, no heirs, no son or daughter or whatever to take the throne. So the empire actually went to his nephew, Johannes, and he became emperor. And my gosh, Paul, that's a distinctly Germanic name. That's how far we've come. Emperor Johannes of Rome. Like, that's shocking to hear someone with that name being Emperor of Rome.
Yeah, Johannes is definitely a name that I have very strong and almost strict association with Germanic languages, of which Latin most certainly is not.
And like, if you were to ask someone, hey, give us a Germanic name, Johann or Johannes would definitely be one of the first ones they would say in like a family fortunes type scenario.
Or Fritz.
Exactly. So this ended the reign of Honorius. And then I want to talk about the nitty gritty here, Paul, how Honorius is remembered. And he's kind of remembered as a bit of an imbecile, caring more for his chickens than his empire. And
sounds like something of a pill.
Yeah, well, words I've seen to describe him are feckless, timid, and passive. And he let a lot of his big decisions be made by others. And of course,
I think feckless is a really good adjective based on what you've described here.
Exactly.
So far.
It's a terrific word, feckless. And of course, he's seen as the emperor who let Rome get sacked under his watch. It was a city that had probably never been sacked. And having that happen under your watch isn't a good thing. It's almost being like the prime minister. It's almost like being prime minister for one day and then the queen dies.
Oh boy.
Sorry.
Oh boy.
Feel free to cut that out.
Here we go.
Just say.
Here we go.
Feel free to... Sorry, Liz, both of you.
Go on.
So having that happen under your watch isn't a good thing. And of course, he gave away Britain too, was mentioned in a whole episode unto itself. And he had some pretty strange quirks. But Paul, the question I want to ask you and ask the audience, was he really the worst emperor of Rome?
No.
No.
No, not based on what you've described.
No.
He's one of the goofiest emperors of Rome.
Totally. Like, worst is such a subjective word. You mean like quality-wise, or like he wasn't evil? Like, he wasn't like a Nero or a
No.
Domitian. Is Domitian?
No.
Yeah, he wasn't. Yeah, I get my D emperors mixed up. He wasn't evil in that same way. He was just a bit of an imbecile, like you said, a pill, a doofus.
So you bring up the word evil, and and this is something that, from if you're listening to the AD History podcast, you're somebody who, in all likelihood, takes history quite seriously. In addition to loving it to pieces. But as a historian, one of the most difficult words to deal with in a mature analysis of history is the term evil, or really, in many cases, a lot of these moral adjectives. Because to what extent is it something of that you can quantify and qualify in a way that's really meaningful, in a way that can really walk away with something that isn't quite so subjective? And this is going to sound terribly nihilistic, but good and evil are so often in the eyes and mind and heart of the beholder. And so it leads the historian into some difficult territory in terms of, well, what do I do with that? You can clearly say somebody has done horrifically destructive things and caused tremendous death, suffering, poverty, whatever the case may be. But evil or good are all things that, unfortunately, due to their deeply subjective nature, even if we are all able to rally around generally on some common shared virtues in regards to what we would consider good versus evil, which in many cases I'd like to think that there are some things that it doesn't take a whole symposium to come to some sort of consensus on the subject. But evil has always been one of the most difficult descriptors for a historian, where it's also, in certain respects, somewhat imprecise as well.
People are so, like, it's easy to portray people as like these one-dimensional, you're an evil person, you're a bad guy, you're a good guy, but people and humans are so multifaceted. There's even some of history,
black and white just doesn't exist.
Exactly, yeah. Even
at least not in absolute terms.
Even like there's some more favorable qualities in some of history. So some of the figures of history who have been dubbed well and truly evil. We don't need to name any in particular, but you know the kinds we're talking about. There
absolutely
is so, if you look into their lives, there is some good there. Like, you'll see, oh, they were a great parent, they like did this well, that sort of thing. It's really fascinating. So yeah, evil is a very subjective term, but like when we've looked into, as we have in AD history, looked at some of those sort of emperors who have been dubbed more evil, like Nero, like Domitian, he isn't on this level on the rest. But then conversely, talking about evil, people like Hadrian and Trajan. No, Hadrian I'm talking about here.
Yes.
He is dubbed one of the greatest emperors of Rome. But when we had Sam on...
One of the 5 good emperors.
But when we had Sam on for an episode, he told us how in the Jewish communities, he's seen as one of the most evil because of his treatment to the Jews. Like, it's so freaking subjective.
Yeah, he acted in a horrifically destructive fashion that led to a tremendous amount of loss of human life.
So like,
and yet he is still considered one of the 5 good emperors.
Exactly.
And so when you start getting into terms like good and evil as the historian, it's well and fine when you're discussing it just casually and we can all get around it. But when you start getting into discussions and analysis of history where precision is so important that you have to find better descriptors.
Yeah.
Things that can be truly
Quantifiable.
qualified and quantified to come to more precise and far more not meaningful, but far more definitive conclusions in ways that simply categorizing good and evil in the historical context of a historical subject as such, it leads you down a whole bunch of very odd roads when there are better ones.
But what I will say, maybe to wrap things up, while Honorius definitely, no matter what way you quantify, he definitely wasn't the worst emperor, but he definitely wasn't the best either.
No.
No.
I mean, save some of his goofier moments here, and specifically the story that grew up around his reaction to what was happening to Rome. If he weren't so goofy, in some ways, he might be otherwise quite forgettable.
Exactly. And one last
given
question.
how feckless he was.
Exactly. And one last question that comes to mind for me is, would any other emperor have done a better job at this time in Western Roman history? You know, Western Rome was so deeply struggling at the time. Like, could anyone have done any better? Minus another, like, Diocletian rising from the ashes or something like that. Could anyone have done any better than this?
That also runs into another major issue of the historian, which of course is counterfactual history.
Of course, yeah.
And where then you're legitimately on a path of, well, from what means can I proceed with any sort of meaningful conclusion based on the simple premise because it didn't actually happen.
Yeah, that's very true. But it's something to worth thinking about. But Honorius, you were very silly, but you're definitely not the worst. I think we can both agree on that fact. In any quantifiable way, he probably wasn't the worst.
We have seen far more destruction. We've seen far more incompetence. We've seen far more malice. Well, that is quite the subject. It's interesting that just his very nature, Patrick, has led this segment to almost have its own silly quality to it.
Yeah.
And we're not even trying.
No, it's just his general silliness kind of rubs off on us. And I love when things get a bit silly personally. Like, it happens with AD history. Sometimes it happens with Name Explain. When we can sort of just get into something that's ridiculous between some of the more serious stuff, which we're going to be covering in our next middle segment for sure, and what we're going to be covering in your segment as well, Paul. It's good
for the remainder of the episode. This is going to get a lot heavier.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
So let's leave the silliness at the door, I suppose, for now.
We have definitely filled our quota, and based on what's coming next, we'll be glad that we did fulfill that quota. Us here, you there, and we'll be back right after word from AD.
This is the AD History Podcast. Keep up with the show and join the discussion by following AD History on Twitter with the handle @ADHistoryPC and the hashtag ADHistory. Check us out over on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube by searching AD History Podcast, as well as, of course, tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. Also, check out the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See how you can help support the show and the rewards that await you by exploring the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See the link in the description. Now, back to Paul and Patrick.
So, Paul, it's that time again. We're going to hear more about Attila the Hun, and I'm looking forward to learning more about this. Perhaps one of the most infamous figures in ancient history. Paul, set the scene for us, please.
Indeed. It is best to set the scene. Patrick, when we think about the notorious nomadic so-called barbarians of history. Put barbarians in air quotes for all intents and purposes. What are some of them that come to mind? Is Attila not sitting there right next to, say, Genghis Khan?
I mean, I think so. I often link the two together quite closely. They definitely share a same sort of like area of history, that's for sure.
Without a doubt. And so naturally, you hear the name Attila, and it conjures up all sorts of different images of death and destruction and conquest, and conquest, as you imagine they would. And in the course of the next 3 episodes, we're exploring the singular figure, of course, Attila the Hun. No discussion of the fate of Europe from this point in the show forward can be had without Attila. His relatively short life and overall rule are endlessly fascinating. And in this episode, we are looking at how the young man would find his way to power as
Attila the Young, sorry.
Indeed, Attila the Young when he was Attila the Young. And because this is a 3-part episode, because this life and figure is just so important and there's so much information, relatively speaking, we are doing this, and this is the first of 3 parts, and today we are learning about Attila the Young and how he found his way to power. Attila in power it definitely conjures up in the popular imagination one of the quintessential barbarians from history. His name ranks with Genghis Khan, and his name is just historically prolific. And Attila continues, it does not rank in the scope to the same extent as Genghis Khan because the Khanates, they conquered large swaths of 2 continents, and his name definitely suggests in the popular imagination more conquest than Attila actually achieved. But that's also part of the strength of that legend, is it not?
Totally. Something I find interesting is when we think barbarian, we tend to think like Northern European, at least I do anyway. I think sort of Germanic tribes, sort of your Viking sort of tribe. And he wasn't that at all. He was from like Asia, I guess, initially as a nomadic person. That's not often an area we tend to think of with barbarianism.
Well, we definitely discussed this quite a bit in terms of the origin of the European Huns in the previous season, where they came from. And at this point, they're very much what we would call the European.
Oh, okay then. Okay.
Yeah. So where does this legend of Attila and the reality of the man who was Attila even meet? Was it that Attila seems so outsized compared to the likely reality? How can this be reconciled? And to answer these questions, we need to look at the European Huns themselves. And as we discussed in last season's episode, The Huns, History's Perfect Enigma, uncovering accurate factual and historical truths about the European Huns is wrought with vexing pitfalls of all varieties. It is more than the occasional and unmistakable soul-stirring thousand-yard stare. The Huns were not a literate culture, possessing no known written language by which to tell their own story, recording critical cultural elements for posterity, or telling their side of the proverbial story in any way that could reasonably survive into modernity, Patrick. To a certain extent, they prove the exception to the widely understood adage, victors write the history. Foremost, it is nigh daunting to write the history in a culture that only seemingly possessed an oral tradition. Moreover, their enemies and rivals by the name of Rua the Hun, which is the predecessor to Attila and his brother Bleda, and of course them being their, his quite infamous successors, chiefly the Romans of both the eastern and western hues, were both prolific and indefatigable historians of their own civilization, and at times others as well. Thus leading to the outcomes of the Hunnic enemies writing the history for their European Hunnic rivals, insofar as they could reasonably do so. Indeed, the appearance of the Huns finding their way through the Urals and over the river Volga, the natural barriers often recognized at the eastern demarcation between Europe and Asia, in the late 360s and early 370s, leaving the Romans in particular with far more questions than answers for those folks who are basically trying to figure out the details of their origins.
And I guess it's interesting because when you sort of stop to think about this, it seems as if only throughout the course of history of advanced human civilization, the casualty of that tossed around, sort of the idea of victors write the history, would be fewer in case than you presumed. Like you said, Attila was the victor in many circumstances, but him and his people didn't really write all that much. This was like Roman historians writing about their victory. So at what point throughout the greater epoch of advanced human civilization do societies turn the corner and develop literary societies as opposed to like oral traditions?
Well, that's a really good question, and one, that I'm curious about in terms of your experience in Name Explain. Obviously, you've had to have run across more than a few situations where a subject you're talking about had to have included a society that basically only had an oral tradition, right?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, especially talking about Hungary and the Huns, obviously, Hungary is one of those few countries I haven't really delved all that much into, and its etymology isn't the most clear. Despite being a very popular nation, having a very unique name unto itself, it's not a something land or a something ear. Hungary's a very unique name, but there's not much information out there, and let alone their own name for their land, which I can't even attempt to pronounce. I can't remember how we say Hungary.
Yeah,
And
I remember that.
it's a hell of a name, but it's something I want to talk about. But there's just not as much information out there as opposed to, say, when we're talking about the Romans, because they were so good at writing down their information, and something especially with Name Explain, because Name Explain is so language centric. And I think I've said in the past, language doesn't preserve in the same way a dinosaur bone or an ancient piece of pottery does. There's no physical form. It just goes away, and it is so hard to find things sometimes. So when you do come across,
Even when it's written down,
of course, like we're lucky to have so much from ancient Rome still with us today. So yes, I have come across this with oral tradition, and you kind of just got to, I don't want to say wing it. You've kind of, when I do videos like that, I like to make it as clear as possible that we don't know this entirely. Some things are lost to history, and it's just being aware of that whenever you go into something like this.
well, the thing that I'm curious about is, and this is more just a general observation based once again on your experience with Name Explain, because you're dealing with these kind of matters as a matter of course, which is, do you ever, is there a point in the history when you've begun noticing that oral traditions and cultures that generally don't write things down and only pass them on in an oral way start to begin to disappear? Is there a point in time, a part of temporal demarcation when you start seeing this go away in your experience?
So the closest I can kind of come to that, I haven't noticed an exact turning off point, but I've often sort of said to myself and others, some of the videos I enjoy doing most tend to be ones, especially when it comes to country and geography, tend to be ones based in North and South America. And that is because a lot of those countries, and especially their modern names in those modern countries, are a lot more recent in history. We know a lot more about their names and their origins because it was from a time of history, say, what was that, like the 1500s, 1400s onwards? Kind of very much the start of the modern era, in which there is vastly much more information out there about how these places got their names. Take somewhere like Bolivia, we know for sure it was named after Simon Bolivar, and we know his life and his history. Then you get to a country like Poland, or even like more Asian, like China or Japan or Korea, and there just isn't as much information out there. They're not as fun videos to produce because the facts just aren't there. It's all just kind of a bit ambiguous. So I would say you kind of notice it around the turn of the beginning of the modern era of history. Once you get through the Middle Ages and antiquity, as we're in now, almost approaching the Middle Ages, it's kind of from that point onwards we tend to get a bit more clarity on, especially in regards to where names of countries and places came from.
That's interesting. Given the situation and what we're dealing with here, even though we've covered the Huns in the past, it is important that before we get into Attila himself, that we really do once again briefly lay the groundwork for who these people were, and of course their most infamous interactions coming with the Romans themselves, being such a critical player in what would turn out to be the fate of the Western Empire.
Yeah, and something I'm curious about, Paul, is as we mentioned, most of what we know about the Huns came from Roman sources. So, did the Romans actually know much about the Huns and like their origins?
They knew surprisingly little. They had a general idea
Hmm.
of the direction they came from, and undoubtedly they heard the old apocryphal story about how you had the Huns that were basically sitting in the Kuban in southern Russia that we would call today, and you had Goths in Crimea, and that some basically Hunnic hunters went into the marshy lowlands near the Kerch Strait and while following game, and they realized that there was a beautiful temperate land just beyond. And the fact that they only found that out then is really quite unbelievable. The Kerch Strait is very narrow,
Hmm.
and the waters would have been, I think, if I understand correctly, even lower at this point. So that's kind of the extent of what they knew, and it wasn't exactly easy getting the answers they would have been looking for. That much is certain.
So, like, in this time when the Huns sort of seemed like something of a distant threat in some strange way, what did the Romans think of them? What was their view on these sort of rivals during this sort of period of history?
Well, first off, the one thing that they could definitely say for sure is that they seem, from the Roman perspective, to show up out of nowhere. Generally, in this great migration that we had talked
We've
about
talked
at
about
length.
that,
Yeah, exactly. So here's something that's interesting, and this is after a bit of time has passed and there's been established relations diplomatically and, certainly conflict back and forth between the Romans and the Huns. And as you may remember, our old friend Ammianus Marcellinus was a 4th century Roman soldier and, more importantly, historian passing along this information from the late 4th century. The following is a selection from his written impressions describing, in his view, in an educated Roman historian perspective of the era, the physical appearance of the Huns and just his general impressions of them overall. And here Marcellinus writes, quote, "The people of the Huns, but little is known from ancient records, dwelling beyond the Maeotic Sea, near the sea-blind ocean, exceed every mode of savagery. Since the cheeks of the children are deeply furrowed with the steel from their very birth, in order that the growth of hair, when it appears at the proper time, may be checked by the wrinkled scars. They grow old without beards and without any beauty, like eunuchs. They all have compact, strong limbs and thick necks, and so monstrously ugly and misshapen, that one might take them for 2-legged beasts or for the stumps rough hewn into images that are used in putting sides into bridges. But although they have the form of men, however ugly, they are so hardly in their mode of life that they have no need of fire, nor of savory food. When away from their homes, they never enter a house unless compelled by extreme necessity, for they think they are not safe when staying under a roof. They dress in linen cloth or in the skins of field mice sewn together, and they wear the same clothing indoors and out." Close quote. That's Ammianus Marcellinus.
That's a hell of a description there. It's almost not human at points. Like,
It
clearly,
definitely gives you kind of an idea of how the Romans are thinking about these folks.
totally. And like, the Romans have probably very rarely seen people of this race, of this ethnicity, I suppose, to some extent. That is clearly quite a shock. We live in a day and age where we see people of all different appearances, but I guess even though the Roman Empire was pretty large and did cover a huge variety of ethnicities and races, clearly people like this were just alien to some extent to the Romans. And of course, it's just sort of described like savages, grown without beards, like eunuchs. That's a hell of a description. Don't go inside if they don't have to. Even skins of field mice sewn together. That's so weird. Like, why mice? That's just it's very. That's something I picked up. Very strange.
The tone has a classic condescending Roman tone to it. There is nothing grander than the Latin culture and the Roman civilization.
Anything beyond that is just, it almost like, it comes off a bit like just xenophobic and racist to an extent of like very ancient conceptions.
You know, it's just Romans being Romans.
Yeah, that too.
Without a doubt. Where does Attila fall into all of this? While there is no definitive known date for when Attila was actually born, it is believed that he was born circa 406 AD. He and his brother Bleda were the sons of a Hunnic chieftain by the name of Mundusk, who himself was the brother of the Hunnic king Rua and Akhtar that ruled jointly for a time. So there's little question that Attila was from about as noble a dynastic Hunnic lineage as any that would have existed at the time of the early 5th century or late 4th century. The previous passage with Marcellinus's description of Hunnic life was extremely unlikely to have ever truly represented Attila's life and experience, and growing up in that higher echelon of Hunnic society. In fact, Attila had some experiences far more familiar to us than you would think. Apparently, Attila, around age 12, served in the role of a VIH, very important hostage, as we might call it, during an arrangement with the Romans that gave him an invaluable experience to learn his later Roman foes almost intimately, serving as a helpful insight for managing his future Hunnic-Roman relationships. Romans in earlier centuries, and possibly even still then, still saw arrangements as an opportunity, namely to create sympathy on the part of said captives towards Rome and the culturally Latin way of life. It didn't quite work out that way with Attila, however, but it's quite an experience for Attila, especially when he's coming to know who the Romans are and how to deal with them later on.
And something I found interesting about that, Paul, is it goes against that sort of textbook image we have of Attila to some extent, of being that sort of savage barbarian. That wasn't his case. So he sounded like he was from quite high Hunnic society, really. So it kind of immediately goes against many of us, our preconceived notion of what Attila was like. But we've all heard about how the Romans viewed their classic Hunnic rivals in the early 5th century. And are there any first-hand accounts describing like Attila's personality? Or is there even like a description of his physical appearance? Because I have an image of Attila in my head. Where has that come from?
Well, I'm sure in that case, there are many situations where it's a product of long-held Roman propaganda. So I have an answer for you, but it's, possibly secondhand. But yes, in fact, there is a very famous one attributed to Priscus of Paneum, who we'll actually hear more from in our next episode, in the next part on the subject. From Priscus, quote, "He was a man born into the world to shake the nations, the scourge of all lands, who in some way terrified all mankind by the dreadful rumors noised abroad concerning him. He was haughty in his walk, rolling his eyes hither and thither, so that the power of his proud spirit appeared in the movement of his body. He was indeed a lover of war, yet restrained in action, mighty in counsel, gracious to supplicants, and lenient to those who were once received into his protection, short of stature, with a broad chest and a large head. His eyes were small, his beard thin and sprinkled with gray, and he had a flat nose and swarthy skin, showing evidence of his origin." Close quote. Once again, that's Priscus of Paninium, a diplomat in service to the Eastern Roman Empire, a little bit later on, who will once again encounter in one of our upcoming editions of this particular topic.
So that description fits somewhat with the generic description of Huns in general, I'd say, to a degree.
That it does, but you also notice there are certain parts about it where, and I don't think I'm reading too far into this, but they're almost complementary.
Oh, totally.
In a way.
He was born,
especially when you start getting into his personality. He was indeed a lover of war, yet restrained in action, mighty in council, gracious to supplicants, and lenient to those who were once received into his protection.
Born into the world to shake the nations. Like we've never really come across someone like that thus far in AD history.
And it's also important to note that in the opening of that passage there, he refers to Attila as the scourge of all lands. Indeed, one of the ways he's referred to, and even known today, is basically by the very interesting title, the Scourge of God. But he clearly, in this case, Priscus, does have a certain admiration for how Attila carries himself. Now, granted, this is not when he's a boy, this is when he's much older, but it definitely conveys from the Roman perspective a certain refinement about him, which is to say that, yes, he may look like a foul, appearing barbarian, but he is refined. He knows what he is doing, and he's somebody to take very seriously and hold in high regard.
This is a bit of a tangent, but do you know what's coming to mind for me a little bit in all this? Frankenstein's monster. So this is kind of fitting because we're recording this around the Halloween season. If you've read the original book by Mary Shelley, so that idea of the Frankenstein's monster being this big, green, low intelligence monster is actually so far removed from how Shelley portrayed him in the original novel. He is described as like this hulking mass. He's actually described being somewhat handsome, but having these sort of grotesque features, and his handsome features make his grotesque features look worse. But he's also a highly educated creature. He reads a lot of books. I don't know if you read the book, but I'm not making this up. He's
it's interesting. Those are elements of Frankenstein's monster that are not popularly portrayed.
No, not at all. And it's fantastic because literally the original book's one of my favorite books out there. I love it to pieces. He's portrayed as like this very elegant, Byronic kind of figure, which makes sense because obviously Shelley's relations with Lord Byron, her friendship, her kinship with him. And that kind of that idea of like this hulking mass of a human, but it's actually got some brains and some finesse behind him. It's just what came to mind when you read that description.
It's interesting to say the least. So I wouldn't say that Priscus's description quite fits the profile many of us have of Attila, that's for sure. Though in truth, all the better. This is far more prosaic description, gets us away from literature and the Hollywood-esque impressions of Attila and creates someone altogether more human. I don't know about you, but the more human a figure is shown to be, especially in history, the more impressive and at times the more terrifying they can be.
Totally. I love finding the human element of these historical figures.
Absolutely. Now, in terms of his coming of age, during the not altogether extensive rule of his uncle Rua, Attila and his brother Bleda waited in the wings for their time to come. It was undoubtedly a very turbulent time for the Huns, the surrounding Goths of various stripes, largely found in the Hungarian plains as well as in Pannonia, the Balkans, and the Roman Empire stretching all the way to Constantinople. They were surrounded by potential rivals, and any Hunnic king of any stripe or hue has to be able to navigate this very complex and often changing geopolitical landscape, to be sure. And that's altogether very difficult. But one thing is for sure, based on the little that we know, and unfortunately, it is very little that we know about the young Attila, it does seem that in one way or another, he was most certainly brought up and had the experiences that someone of his standing and nobility in, Hunnic European society would need ultimately to accede to that ruling role. And unfortunately, this is all we know really about this young Attila. He clearly was being prepared. He was clearly in a place where he was going to accede to this position, though not alone. When his uncle Rua dies in 434, he actually accedes to ruler of the Huns with his brother Bleda. And that is where we're going to leave off for today, when in our next episode and our next installment, the second of 3 about Attila the Hun, we're going to discuss his early years in power and ruling with Bleda, which has a very unique twist to it, to say the least. But that's what I have for you here today, Patrick. A bit complex, but once again, it's a three-part.
No, this is going to be a fascinating three-part, Paul. I love when we get the chance to really deep dive, take multiple episodes to go into a historic figure, a historical event. It has been absolutely fascinating. I've probably learned more about Attila the Hun in this segment alone than I knew previously. And he's an enigmatic figure for sure. And you can't help but feel there's something of a right place, right time kind of thing going on here, because Rome was primed for plucking right now. And it seems the best time for a charismatic person like Attila the Hun, a vicious warlord, hungering for war, as we talked about, as he was described earlier, to be on the scene.
You got that right. But us here, you there, and we'll be back right afterward from the voice of AD history herself, Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast.
Well, that does it for us today. Patrick, where can people find us?
You can find me personally primarily on Instagram at NameExplainYT. But you can also find me on Twitter at NameExplainYT, and of course on YouTube, search NameExplain. What about you, Paul?
In addition to my usual work at TGNR at tgnreview.com, you can find me at my Twitter handle at PKD in History, as well as my reader-submitted World War II Q&A column, the World War II Brain Bucket, where I answer all World War II related questions, which if you are on YouTube, we will have a link down in the description.
That's all today from myself. Goodbye, thank you, and take care.
Yes, thank you all so much. Until next time.
Like all good things, we come to an end for today. Thank you for listening to the AD History Podcast. It is listeners such as yourself who make this show possible and truly awesome. Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found. Also, follow AD History on social media. Follow the show on Twitter at the handle at ADHistoryPC, as well as on Facebook by visiting facebook.com/ADHistoryPodcast and Instagram as AD History Podcast. In addition to liking and subscribing on YouTube by searching AD History Podcast. Do you have a direct comment or question for Paul and Patrick? Drop them an email at adhistorypodcast@tgnreview.com. Also, be sure to visit the show's homepage at tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. For Paul and Patrick, thank you for listening to the AD History. We'll see you again next time in the ever-growing tapestry of world history.